Graham Lockwood never expected to see anyone step foot in Alec's room again. Not since the funeral, not since the silence fell over the house like a curse. But that night, something felt off. A storm outside had knocked out part of the power grid. The chandelier in the main hallway flickered as he walked upstairs, flashlight in hand. The old house creaked under his steps, familiar and hollow. As he reached the top landing, a soft light spilled from under a door that should have been locked. Alec's door. He frowned. No one had permission to enter that room. He had made sure of it. The doorknob turned easily in his hand. Unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, quietly, like someone entering a memory they were never meant to revisit. What he saw inside wasn't just unexpected. It was haunting. Ava. His maid. She was sitting on the tiled floor of Alec's ensuite bathroom, water streaming from the open shower behind her. Her knees were drawn to her chest, long wet hair plastered to her back, and in her arms, clutched like something sacred, was a torn silver dress. It shimmered even in ruin. She didn't notice him. Her shoulders trembled as she cried, her lips moving with silent words. There was no performance, no dramatics, just quiet devastation. He should have turned away, should have closed the door and pretended he never saw her. But his feet stayed rooted, and his breath caught in his throat. Eva had always been the quiet one, the invisible one, efficient, polite, professional. She never asked questions, never made demands. She had worked in his house for months, and in all that time, Graham had barely exchanged more than a few sentences with her. Now he couldn't look away. Her nakedness wasn't what stunned him. It was her grief, raw, unfiltered, honest. The way she held the dress like it meant more than fabric and thread. The way her fingers trembled as she pressed it to her chest, as if it once belonged to someone she had loved and lost. Alec. The name floated through his mind before he could stop it. He took a step back, slowly. The wooden floor creaked under his shoe. Eva's head snapped up. Their eyes met. Hers were wide with horror, cheeks wet with tears and water. She scrambled to pull the dress over herself, but it barely covered her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Graham backed away. He closed the door without a word. Down the hall, he stood in the shadows for a long while, listening to the steady rush of water and the quiet sobs behind it. His heart pounded, though he didn't understand why. Something about the way she held that dress unsettled him. Something about her pain felt deeply familiar. He returned to his room, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. The silence pressed down on him. For the first time in years, Alec's name sat heavy on his tongue. Eva. Alec. The silver dress. He couldn't sleep that night, not because of what he saw, but because of what it made him feel. Graham Lockwood had never intended to inherit silence, yet ever since his younger brother Alec's death, that was all the house gave him. Silence in the hallways, silence at breakfast, silence in the once vibrant music room now locked shut. For 2 years, the Lockwood estate had stood like a museum of grief, polished on the surface, hollow beneath. Graham lived there alone, not for comfort, but out of duty. The house had been passed down for generations. It was his now, along with the money, the business, and the emptiness. He hadn't spoken Alec's name out loud in over a year. The two brothers had been different in every way. Graham was the eldest, the planner, the one who carried expectations on his back since childhood. Alec had been the artist, the dreamer, full of warmth and foolish hope. He painted, composed music, disappeared for days just to photograph the sunrise in a remote valley. Graham often rolled his eyes at Alec's spontaneity, but secretly he admired it. When Alec died in a car accident 2 years ago, Graham didn't cry. He handled arrangements, wrote the eulogy, shook hands at the funeral, and buried every emotion in the locked drawers of his mind. He thought he had moved on, until he saw Eva. Eva Monroe had arrived at the estate 6 months ago through an agency. She was quiet, maybe even shy, but efficient in a way Graham appreciated. She cleaned without needing reminders, never lingered where she wasn't supposed to, and never asked questions. Her eyes were always cast downward, her voice barely above a whisper, yet she had a strange steadiness about her, like someone who had lived through too much too soon. He didn't know where she was from, didn't ask. He didn't need to. She did her job, and that was enough. Or it had been. The morning after he found her in Alec's room, Graham walked past her in the main hall. She bowed her head like usual, murmured a quiet "Good morning, sir," and went back to folding linen. Her face was blank, untouched by the storm of the night before. If he hadn't seen her broken in the shower, naked and clutching that ruined silver dress, he might have believed nothing was wrong. But he had seen, and now he couldn't unsee. That day he found himself watching her, not intentionally, not with judgment or suspicion, but with curiosity. She moved with the same precision, but there was something brittle in the way her hands hovered over delicate fabrics, something far away in her expression when she stood by the window too long. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way she touched old books with care, the way she paused outside the piano room as if listening for a sound she missed. He wondered what the dress meant, whose it was, why it had been torn, why she had cried like someone grieving something too old to name. Part of him wanted to ask, but another part held back. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to begin a conversation. The housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, who had served the family for decades, noticed the shift in him. At breakfast, she asked if everything was all right. Graham nodded without looking up. He didn't want to talk, not yet. Not until he understood what that night had opened in him. That evening, Graham stood outside Alec's room. He hadn't entered it in over a year. After Alec's death, he had locked it, refusing to let anyone clean or touch a single thing inside. But now the door had been opened, not by him, but by someone who clearly had a reason. He turned the knob and stepped inside. The air was stale with old paper and dried paint. The walls were still covered in Alec's sketches. The bed was neatly made, the bookshelf lined with journals, some with worn covers and frayed edges. And on the dresser, half hidden beneath a stack of papers, was a single bobby pin, small, silver, out of place. Graham picked it up and held it in his palm. He didn't know why, but he knew it belonged to Ava. Something had happened between her and Alec, something he had never been told, and now, without meaning to, he had opened the door to a past that hadn't finished speaking. He left the room without touching anything else. The weight in his chest was different this time. Not guilt, not loss. Something he couldn't name. But it had her face. Graham began noticing the smallest things. Noticing was never his habit. He had built his fortune by focusing on systems, logic, deliverables, things that could be managed. Emotions, people, nuance, those belonged to Alec's world. Yet now, Graham found himself watching Eva Monroe with the kind of quiet intensity he used to reserve for market data and quarterly projections. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was something more elusive. A question. Eva kept to herself more than ever in the days following that night. She moved through the house like a whisper. She avoided eye contact. She stopped humming softly as she cleaned, something Graham hadn't realized he'd grown used to hearing until it vanished. She folded sheets like they might shatter. She wiped windows without looking out of them. When she passed by the piano room, she no longer paused. She never came near Alec's room again. The torn dress was never mentioned. At first, Graham tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He focused on work. He responded to emails, read reports, listened to investor calls, but everything felt distant, like he was watching his own life from behind glass. At night, he would find himself sitting in the dark hallway outside Alec's door, wondering if Eva had loved his brother, and if she had, why had Alec never told him? One afternoon, while walking past the laundry room, Graham overheard a faint gasp. He paused. The door was open. Inside, Eva was standing still, her back to him. She had dropped a basket, and the contents were scattered across the floor, fresh linens, towels. and in the middle of them a white shirt stained red. Not blood. Paint. Alex, paint! Graham stepped inside. Eva turned quickly, her expression frozen between fear and shame. He bent down and picked up the shirt. It was one of Alex's old work shirts, the kind he used to paint in, the kind he never threw away. "Where did you find this?" Graham asked, voice even. Eva hesitated. "It was in the back of the wardrobe," she said. "In a box?" Graham nodded slowly. "Why were you in there?" She looked down. "I shouldn't have been. I was looking for an extra pillowcase." He believed her, and he didn't. But something in her tone was not deception. It was exhaustion. She looked like someone who had run out of places to keep her sadness. That night, Graham did something he hadn't done in years. He sat at the old piano in the library. The keys were slightly out of tune. The lid creaked. His fingers, stiff from neglect, found their place on muscle memory alone. He began to play. A simple melody, one Alec had written long ago. A tune that had no name, but had always sounded like longing. From the corner of his eye, he saw her. Eva, standing in the doorway, silent. He didn't stop playing, and she didn't move. When the last note faded, he looked up. She met his gaze. "I didn't know you played," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in front of her. "I don't," he replied. "Not really. Alec used to make me learn, said it would teach me patience." She smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it. He was good at seeing the parts of people they didn't want to look at. Graham closed the lid gently. "You knew him better than I did, didn't you?" Eva didn't answer right away. "I don't know if that's true," she said. "But he let me see who he really was, and I let him see me. That doesn't happen often." Graham exhaled slowly. The room felt too full and too empty all at once. "Why didn't he tell me?" he asked, and he hated how small his voice sounded. Eva stepped further into the room, her fingers brushing the edge of a bookshelf. "He was going to," she said. "He wanted to, but I told him not to rush. I was scared your family would look at me like I didn't belong here." She paused. "I guess I didn't." Graham shook his head. "That was never for you to prove." His tone surprised even himself. He had never defended anyone this way, not even Alec. Over the following days, the silence between them shifted. It no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like space being made. They didn't speak often, but when they did, the words were heavier, softer. Graham began finding excuses to be near her. A question about inventory, a comment on her cooking, a passing remark about the garden. She never lingered, never assumed. But he felt something changing. One evening, Graham returned home earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to set, casting golden light through the high windows. As he walked past the dining room, he heard music, not from a speaker, but soft and live. He followed it to the back of the house. There, in the small sitting room, Eva was playing Alec's guitar. She didn't see him. She was sitting on the windowsill, barefoot, the guitar resting against her knee, her fingers moving carefully over the strings. The melody was gentle, unfinished, like someone remembering how to breathe. When she finally noticed him, she startled and stood up too fast, nearly dropping the instrument. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I shouldn't have." "Don't," Graham said, stepping inside. "Don't apologize for remembering him." Eva looked at him for a long moment, then sat down again. "Sometimes I forget what he sounded like. But when I play this, I hear him." Graham sat across from her. "Do you miss him every day?" She nodded, but not the same way anymore. At first it was like a fire. Then it became fog. Now it's just quiet, but it's always there. He understood that kind of grief, the kind that doesn't scream, just sits beside you like a shadow. "You make it sound less terrible," he said. "You make it sound livable." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Maybe that's all grief is. learning how to live beside the empty seat. They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't hollow, it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that builds something. That night, Graham didn't sleep in his usual room. He stayed in the library, reading through Alec's journals. He found sketches of Eva, descriptions of their late-night talks, lines like, "She sees things I miss, and she listens like it matters," and one line that caught his breath, "She's not like anyone else, but I can't ask her to live in a world that wouldn't accept her." Graham closed the journal and looked out at the darkened house. For the first time, he didn't feel angry at Alec for keeping secrets. He felt sorry that Alec never got the chance to build a world where Eva could belong. But maybe he could. He thought of Eva's eyes, the quiet way she held music and memories like fragile glass. He thought of the torn dress, the pain she tried to hide, the music she still played, and something inside him shifted. She was no longer just someone who worked in his home. She was someone who made it feel less empty. The following week passed with a quiet rhythm that neither of them tried to disrupt. There were no dramatic confessions, no forced conversations, only an understanding that something between them had shifted. It was in the way Eva lingered a little longer in rooms Graham entered, and how he no longer hid his glances when she walked by. The house, once so hollow, felt warmer somehow. Not because anything had physically changed, but because the silence had begun to soften. Still, there were things unsaid, and Graham could feel them lingering just beneath the surface, like truths waiting to be spoken when the right moment came. That moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Graham had been sorting through boxes in the attic, boxes he had avoided for years. Most of them belonged to Alec, old journals, sketchbooks, photographs, things their parents had packed away without ceremony. He had almost given up when he found a thin leather notebook tied with a black ribbon. It was different from the others, older, worn. He untied it carefully and opened to the first page. There, in Alec's messy handwriting, was a name he hadn't expected. Ava Monroe. At first he thought it might be a coincidence, but as he read further, it became clear. The entries were dated from almost 3 years ago. Alec had written about a girl he met at a community arts center, a girl who cleaned classrooms and stayed behind after hours to play piano when she thought no one was listening. Alec had seen her once through a window and been captivated. He hadn't approached her right away. He watched, waited, listened. When they finally spoke, it was because she had caught him sketching her and asked why. Graham read entry after entry. Alec had fallen for her fast, not in a reckless way, but in a quiet, consuming way. He had written about her kindness, her silences, her laugh that rarely came but stayed with him when it did. He had written about wanting to bring her to the estate, to introduce her to Graham, but there had always been hesitation in his words. He didn't think she'd be accepted, not by their parents, not by the world that surrounded them. Graham felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He closed the notebook, took a breath, and went downstairs. He found Ava in the garden, trimming the lavender. She looked up when he approached, her expression calm but cautious. Graham handed her the notebook. She didn't speak at first. She held it like it might disappear. When she finally opened it, her hands trembled. "I thought this was lost," she whispered. "He used to read pieces of it to me, but he never let me see the whole thing." Graham sat beside her on the bench. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know how much he loved you." Eva didn't cry, but her voice was thick. "It wasn't just love. He made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible. I didn't have a family, not really. He was everything gentle I never thought I deserved." Graham looked at her, the weight in his chest pressing tighter. "Why didn't you tell me you knew him?" She hesitated. "Because I thought you'd send me away. Because I thought maybe you resented me for being part of a version of Alec you never got to see?" Graham shook his head slowly. "I didn't resent you. I resented myself. I didn't understand him. I thought he wasted time, gave too much, cared too easily. But now I realize He just knew how to love better than I ever did." Eva turned to him. "He looked up to you. He said you protected him even when you didn't know how. He wanted you to be proud." Graham looked away, ashamed. "I wasn't kind to him near the end. We argued about the company, about the trust fund, about his future. I told him he was naive, that the world wasn't built for dreamers. I never apologized." Eva placed the notebook on her lap. "He forgave you, long before you needed it. That's just who he was." Graham nodded, his throat tight. "Do you miss him still?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I missed the way he made me feel seen, but lately, I've started to feel that way again. Not because of him, because of you." The words hung between them like a breath held too long. Graham met her eyes. "Ava, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be the person he was." She smiled softly. "I'm not asking you to be him. I just want you to be here." That evening, Graham unlocked the piano room. He dusted the keys, opened the windows, and left the door ajar. Later, when Ava passed by, she stepped inside without hesitation. She sat beside him on the bench, their shoulders almost touching. She played the melody Alec had written for her, and Graham played the one Alec had written for him. 2 songs that had never meant to meet, finally in harmony. Over the next few days, the estate felt lighter. Graham invited Eva to sit with him at breakfast. They spoke of small things at first, books, the weather, music, then of deeper things, childhood, regrets, dreams. He learned she had once wanted to become a teacher. She had loved literature, had written poetry in secret. He told her about the time Alec broke his arm trying to climb the roof to retrieve a kite, and how he blamed Graham for distracting him. They laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. One morning, Eva brought him coffee with a note folded beneath the cup. It was a poem, one Alec had written for her but never finished. She had added the last lines herself. He read it slowly, twice, then looked up at her. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes was no longer distant. It was present, and so was he. Later that week, Graham took her to the greenhouse. It had been Alec's favorite place, once filled with rare plants and wild ideas. It had fallen into disuse. Dust clung to the glass, the soil dried, the pots empty. Graham stood in the center and said, "I want to turn this into something new, not to forget him, but to build from him." Eva touched the edge of a broken pot. "What do you want to grow here?" Graham looked at her. "Whatever helps us stay alive." That night, they sat on the library floor, reading passages from Alec's journals aloud. They took turns laughing, pausing, grieving. When Graham read a line that said, "If I go before I'm ready, tell her she was never a detour," he looked up to find Eva watching him with eyes full of something fragile and steady. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke of love, not yet. But something deeper had begun. Not a romance born from fantasy, but from the ashes of loss. A beginning made from honesty, pain, and the decision to keep living. Graham lay awake that night, thinking of her in the next room, not as a stranger, not as his brother's past, but as the one person who had quietly walked into the ruins of his silence and stayed. There are moments in life when silence becomes unbearable, not because of what it hides, but because of what it demands. Graham had reached that threshold. The past weeks with Eva had changed something fundamental in him. Where once he had seen her as a fixture of the house, efficient and invisible, he now saw her as a presence he could not ignore. Someone who had entered not just his home, but his thoughts, his habits, and more dangerously, his emotion. What scared him most was that none of it felt wrong. It felt inevitable. Still, Graham knew the world outside their fragile sanctuary would not be as forgiving. One morning, as he walked into his study, he found his mother seated by the window, a half-empty cup of tea on the table beside her. She rarely visited the estate anymore, choosing instead to stay in the city surrounded by art galas and tightly controlled social circles. Her presence was never casual. "Graham," she said without looking up, "I've been hearing things." He didn't respond, waiting for the sentence to complete itself. "About you. And the maid, is it true you've been keeping her here long after her contract expired?" He leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed. "Her contract hasn't expired, and even if it had, she's free to stay as long as she chooses." His mother turned to him, her gaze sharp. "That girl is not one of us. She was nothing more than a passing phase in Alex's life, something he never had the chance to outgrow." Graham's jaw tightened. "You knew about them?" She nodded. "Of course." "Do you think he kept it from everyone?" "He told me, begged me to let him bring her to a family dinner. I refused. I told him there was a line and he knew better than to cross it." Graham stared at her, stunned. "You let him die thinking he wasn't good enough to love who he wanted?" His mother shrugged, not cruelly, but with the kind of cold detachment that had defined her life. "I protected the family name. That is what I was raised to do, and so were you." He stepped away from the desk, his voice low. "Maybe that's why he never came home." She stood. "You're a Lockwood. That means something. Don't throw it away for a housemaid with a broken past and a pretty face." Without waiting for a reply, she left the room, leaving behind the bitter scent of her perfume and a silence that felt like a final warning. That evening, Graham sat on the back terrace, staring out over the hills. The sunset bathed everything in amber, but he felt nothing. Eva joined him, her steps soft, carrying a book in her hand. She sat beside him without speaking. He turned to her, the weight of the conversation with his mother still clinging to his chest. "Did you love him?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "Yes, I loved the part of him that saw me, that didn't ask for a version of me I couldn't offer." Graham nodded. "And me? What do you see in me?" Eva looked at him carefully. "You carry your grief like armor. You think it makes you untouchable, but it only keeps you alone. And I see a man who is terrified to be known, because what if knowing you means leaving you?" His breath caught. "That's exactly it," he said. "I don't know how to be close to someone without waiting for the part where they disappear." She reached for his hand, her touch light but steady. "Then let's stay. Not because we're fearless, but because we're willing." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black car at the front gate. Graham frowned. No one was expected. A few minutes later, Mrs. Linton appeared, her face tight. "Sir, there is someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." The woman standing in the entry hall was tall, poised, and unfamiliar. She introduced herself as Victoria Hale, Alex's former legal advisor. She handed Graham an envelope and said, "This was found recently among Alex's personal effects. It was meant for you. It was sealed. No one read it." She left as quickly as she had arrived. Graham stood there, frozen, the envelope trembling in his hands. He opened it in the study, alone. The letter inside was dated 2 weeks before Alex's death. "Graham, I know we've never seen the world the same way. I've always followed dreams and you've always followed logic. But I need you to understand something. I loved her. Eva. I loved her in a way that made the world quieter. She didn't ask for anything except to be real with me. I was going to tell you. I wanted your blessing, though I didn't need it. But then you said I was a fool, that I was wasting my life, and for a moment, I believed you. I pulled back. I hurt her. And then I didn't have time to make it right. If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. If that's the case, take care of her. Not out of guilt, not because I asked, but because you'll see it too. That she's the kind of person who makes the silence livable. She deserves to be seen. Really seen. The way you never let yourself be, Alec." Graham stared at the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and walked to the greenhouse. Eva was there, watering the seedlings they had planted days before. When she looked up, he held out the letter. She read it in silence, her fingers trembling. When she finished, she pressed the paper to her chest. "He loved you," she said. "He wanted you to live." Graham nodded. "So do I. But not in his shadow, and not if it means losing the chance to build something real. With you." Eva stepped closer. "Then stop punishing yourself. We both lost him. But that doesn't mean we have to lose each other." He reached for her hand, pulled her gently into his arms, and held her like he had been waiting to do so for a long time. Not as a replacement for Alec, not as an echo of the past, but as a beginning. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was honest. That night, Graham opened Alec's room for the first time since Eva had been found there. Together, they cleaned it, repainted the walls, and repurposed it into a music and writing studio for local students. The torn dress was placed in a shadow box on the wall, repaired but not erased. It remained a symbol not of tragedy, but of truth. And in the quiet that followed, the house finally exhaled. The studio they'd built in Alec's room became more than just a tribute. It became a space for healing, not only for Graham and Eva, but for the small group of students who visited every Saturday morning to write, play music, or simply sit in silence and feel safe. For the first time, Graham opened the estate to people outside his tightly managed world, and to his own surprise, it didn't fall apart. It breathed, and slowly, so did he. Eva led most of the sessions, her presence gentle but steady. She didn't position herself as a teacher. She sat among them, asked questions, listened with full attention, and when the silence lingered too long, she played. Her fingers on the piano keys became the sound of belonging. One afternoon, after the students had left, Graham found her sitting alone at the piano. She wasn't playing, just staring at the keys, her expression distant. He sat beside her, waiting. She glanced at him, her voice low. "I had a dream about him last night. Alec, he wasn't sad. He wasn't lost. He just looked at me and said, 'It's your turn now.'" Graham nodded. "Do you think that's what this is, our turn?" She closed the piano lid gently. "I think it might be." They had started to build something quiet and real, but not without shadows. Graham still wrestled with guilt, not just over Alec's death, but over the years he had spent holding people at a distance. Eva, too, carried her own ghosts. There were nights she still cried in her sleep, nights when she pulled away from his touch because the past whispered too loudly. But each time he stayed, and each time she let herself return. What neither of them expected was how quickly the outside world would notice. Word of the studio spread. Local press wrote about the Lockwood estate opening its doors for community arts. Photos circulated. A donor gala was proposed. And with that came questions, whispers, assumptions. One morning, Graham received a call from an old business partner. "You're dating your brother's ex?" the man asked, half laughing, half judging. "Is this grief or guilt, Graham?" Graham didn't answer. He hung up and walked out into the garden where Eva was tending the roses. She looked up immediately. "Something's wrong," she said. He shook his head. "Nothing I can't handle." But his silence that day was heavier than usual. That evening, he sat in the study with a glass of whiskey, staring at the fire. Eva found him there, the room dim, the air dense with things unsaid. She didn't speak at first, just sat across from him. When he finally looked up, he asked, "Do you ever wonder what people think of us?" She raised an eyebrow. "All the time, but I stopped letting it decide how I feel." Graham exhaled. "They think I'm trying to replace him, that I'm rewriting history." Eva leaned forward. "And are you?" He looked at her, voice tight. "No. But sometimes I wonder if you are." She froze. A breath passed between them like a crack in glass. Then, slowly, she stood. You think I'm using you to resurrect a man I've already buried? He didn't respond. That was answer enough. Eva's voice didn't rise. It dropped. I loved Alec. That will never change. But I didn't come back for him. I stayed for you. And if you can't see the difference, then maybe you're not ready for what we're building. She left the room without slamming the door. The silence she left behind wasn't peaceful. It was final. That night, Graham didn't sleep. He replayed her words over and over until they no longer sounded like blame but like truth. The next morning, he went to her room. It was empty. Her things were gone. The shadow box with the dress still hung in Alec's studio, but the music was gone from the halls, so was she. Days passed. The students still came, the house still functioned, but nothing felt alive. Mrs. Linton asked where Ava had gone. Graham told her she had taken some time away. He didn't say why. He didn't know how to. What he did know was that he had driven her away by letting old guilt speak louder than present love. One evening, as he stood in the garden alone, he saw a notebook tucked under a bench. It was one of Eva's, filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and at the very back, a letter. Graham, I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I realized you hadn't stopped punishing yourself. I can't be the one who saves you from that. You have to choose it. Not for Alec, not for me, but for you. I hope you find peace in this place. I hope you keep the studio open. I hope you look at the stars again without wishing you could rewrite them. And when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be where the light feels honest. The words undid him. That night, he didn't drink, he didn't run. He went into the music room and sat at the piano. He played, not Alec's melody, not Eva's, his own. It was rough and unsure, but it was his. The next morning, he began calling art schools. He donated anonymously to every program Eva had ever mentioned. He volunteered at the studio. He taught a writing class. And slowly, the silence inside him began to take shape as something else. Regret no longer ruled him. Purpose did. Months passed before he saw her again. It was spring. The garden bloomed early that year. She returned on a Sunday, standing at the gate with the same quiet presence she had always carried. He met her there, heart racing, unsure of what to say. She spoke first. You found the notebook. He nodded. I found more than that. She looked up at him, uncertain. Are you still afraid? He took her hand. Yes, but I'm not running anymore. This time, she didn't pull away. They walked through the garden together, not as a billionaire and his maid, not as echoes of the past, but as two people who had dared to stay. The dress in the shadow box remained a reminder, not of what they lost, but of what they chose not to let go. In the library, beside Alec's favorite chair, they placed a new frame. Inside was a photo of Eva and Graham with a group of students, laughing, alive. And underneath, a quote from Alec's final letter. She deserves to be seen. The wind that moved through the Lockwood estate in the early summer carried a different kind of quiet than the one that had haunted it for so long. It no longer felt like mourning or loneliness, but like stillness that made space for growth. Graham stood in the garden beside Eva as the last group of students filed out from the studio. Some waved, others offered shy smiles, and a few left handwritten notes of thanks tucked beneath the flower pots. The sunlight touched everything softly, as if the world itself had decided to stop punishing them. He looked over at her, watching how her eyes followed the students with something close to peace. Not just pride, not just relief. Peace. That afternoon, they returned to the studio to make some final touches before the summer break. Graham climbed the ladder to hang a small golden plaque above the entrance. Eva watched from below, arms crossed, smile soft. The plaque read, Jasper's Studio, a place for voices once silenced. It wasn't Alec's name, but it was still about him, about the boy he had once been, the music he never finished, the love he had tried to hold on to. Eva had chosen the name weeks ago. Graham had resisted at first, but eventually he understood. It was never about erasing grief, it was about transforming it. Later, as the evening light settled over the hills, Graham and Eva sat together in Alec's old room, now filled with colors, sound, and books. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, he allowed himself to breathe fully. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked quietly. Eva chuckled. "You didn't even look at me, just nodded and pointed to the floors I needed to mop." He smiled. "I was a different man then." She tilted her face toward his. "You were a wounded man, still are, but now you let yourself feel it." He traced a line down her arm, his voice gentle. "You gave me the space to remember that being broken doesn't mean being empty." She pressed a kiss to his shoulder, her voice just above a whisper. "And you reminded me that being loved doesn't always mean being left." They sat in silence after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because they no longer needed to fill the space between them with explanations. They had lived through the loss, through the confusion, through the guilt, and come out on the other side, not perfect, but whole, not untouched by the storm, but rooted because of it. The torn dress still hung in the shadow box, a quiet reminder of the night everything changed. They never replaced it, never fixed the last rip near the hem. It was their symbol now, not of damage, but of survival, a story stitched into fabric. That night, as they walked back to the house under the stars, Eva took his hand. He looked at her and smiled, a smile that had once been rare but was now real. "Are you happy?" she asked. He paused, then nodded. "I am. Not because life is easy now, or because the past doesn't still visit me, but because I'm not hiding from it anymore." She squeezed his hand. "Then we've already won." The mansion no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. And as they reached the steps and turned back for one last look at the studio glowing in the distance, Graham whispered the words that would stay with Eva forever. "We don't heal by forgetting. We heal by remembering differently, by choosing to love in the same place we were once broken." And with that, they walked forward into a life built, not in spite of pain, but because of how bravely they chose to face it.